That one is, I believe, on a, let's see, I think that's a Monday, actually. So different from our usual time. But again, in a few weeks, I'll send out an announcement about that as well. Okay? So on to our topic today. Our first lecture of the year is going to be on the contemporary politics of indigenous peoples, or Yuanzhu Minzu, in Taiwan. And although it's not well known outside the island, Taiwan has a significant indigenous population, recognized by the state and given special identity status, voting privileges, and land use rights. And the official numbers collected from the State Identification Bureau, or the state registration, is that there are about a little over 2% of the population that are Yuanzhu Minzu, or Yuanzhu Min, so Aborigine or indigenous people. We, as far as I can tell in this program, have never...
So the URM brought this idea into Taiwan, and some very important people followed URM training and were actually part of the Legislative Yuan, and then actually got this here through the National Assembly. So this wording was there. In fact, I really hesitate to state clearly that the government understood what they were doing at the National Assembly when they put this in the Constitution. I think that many people probably didn't know that they were giving collective rights to indigenous peoples. In fact, if you look at the official English translations of these constitutional revisions, both the English of the 1994 and 97 revisions say that the Aborigines have rights. There's nothing about peoples in the English translation of the 1997 revision. So there probably is a little bit of the way in which the indigenous activists were actually able to get something into the Constitution that the politicians might not have been so aware of. But it's in the Constitution now, and it has implications later on. So basically, this creates peoples who have certain rights of sovereignty and self-determination. This is not a question of terminology or name alone. As Neesens noted, membership in a legally defined community with the potential to call upon public sympathies in defense of rights has become the single most important form of belonging. So having this name gives them certain rights in international law and gives them a way of mobilizing support. Now in the 1990s, the Return Our Land movement, 还我土地, demanded the return of traditional territories and reserve land that had, through various methods, been transferred from state or private use, actually transferred from indigenous peoples to state or private use, for such things as national parks or mines, etc. Now at this time, the United Nations, actually since the 1980s, was creating various venues for indigenous peoples to express their concerns, and Taiwanese indigenous activists began attending meetings in Geneva and New York. The main theme of the movement became political autonomy, based on the concept that indigenous peoples, as a result of their ongoing presence on a given territory before colonization, possess inherent sovereignty, which does not end because of the arrival of a state on a given territory. So they inherently possess a form of residual sovereignty, no matter what's happening at the state level. In 1999, this concept was the cornerstone of the new partnership between the indigenous peoples and the Taiwanese government signed by Chen Shui-bian on Orchid Island during a campaign stop. Indigenous activists who signed this sometimes laugh and say that he might not have understood what we meant by indigenous sovereignty, but it is in that document. And indigenous activists have since then interpreted this as a very important state-to-state treaty. Now this momentum continued and basically culminated in the 2005 Basic Law on Indigenous Peoples, 原住民族基本法. And there you have Yunzu in the title of the law. In fact, it's in many different laws now. And this law promised to meet most of the demands of the indigenous social movement, including political autonomy. The Council of Indigenous Peoples expanded in size during this time, and so many indigenous activists joined their ranks. Some activists were concerned that by becoming parts of the government they would lose their radical edge. But at the same time, members of the Legislative Yuan were competing with one another to show that they defended indigenous rights better than the others. So during the entire Chen Shui-bian presidency, there was a real struggle between the Executive Yuan, which was DPP, and the Legislative Yuan, which was KMT. And part of the conflict was trying to prove that their side best protected the interests of indigenous peoples. Now, the apparent success of the indigenous rights movement in Taiwan, especially compared to other countries where indigenous activists have been imprisoned or even murdered, is remarkable and does need to be explained. Now, some people have said that it's because Taiwan wanted to create a non-Chinese identity. In fact, German sinologist Michael Rudolph even went so far as to say that, quote, all of these efforts, of course, had not only the aim to demarcate Taiwan culturally, but also politically from China, unquote. And I think they can explain why some state actors wanted to accept indigenous rights. But it doesn't explain anything about the internal dynamics of the indigenous movements, and it does not address the long institutional roots of indigeneity in the colonial period. So this goes way back to the Japanese period. It's not something that the DPP is instrumentalizing in any way. And since 2008, we can kind of test what Rudolph and others have been saying as a kind of hypothesis, and we can see that, in fact, even with Ma Ying-jeou becoming president, that the momentum has slowed down in some areas, but in other areas has continued in unexpected ways. One of them is that Ma Ying-jeou's government has created courts for indigenous people. And I think this is very important for issues such as hunting and use of forest products. It just began at the beginning of this year. It's still too early to know what's going to happen, but it is something that we can study and think about as we're moving forward. So many of the institutions of indigeneity go back to the Japanese period or to institutions that were created by Chiang Kai-shek. Now, there were changes that happened after 2008, but I don't think that the most important changes happened after 2008. And I think that even where changes happened, it had to do more with other changes in society, even internationally, and very little to do with Ma Ying-jeou. So I think he's part of the political context that they're living in, but certainly does not play a determinant role. So throughout this paper, I talk about what I call 4 unfoldings. The first unfolding that I discuss is a shift from name rectification to livelihood issues. And so, as I mentioned, I discussed the 正名运动. There is the idea that each group of indigenous peoples that are united somehow by dialect or by closely related dialects in one language family should create a tribe, and eventually each tribe will have tribal self-governing bodies and funding for such things as language, curricula, and cultural activities. Now, the Japanese anthropologists identified 9 ethnic groups. So there are books we can refer to from the Japanese period. Some anthropologists thought there should be more, but then the state eventually fixed 9. And that basically stayed the same until the year 2000. And then Chen Shui-bian started recognizing local demands to create new tribes. They're all split-offs from existing tribes. And this has continued To many people's surprise, under Mainjo, in August 2014, the Kanakanavu and the Khala'alua were recognized as independent from the Zhou tribe. And so ethnogenesis is something that both the KMT and the DPP can do. Generally, it's been observed that these changes are strategically planned to influence the results of local and legislative elections. So most likely this change happened just 2 months ago because they're thinking about the year-end elections. So from a village level, and this is the level that anthropologists tend to do best at analyzing, the rather abstract and political nature of identity changes makes their necessity difficult for local people to understand. They often perceive the creation of new organizations or new tribal identities or any kind of institutional change related to new ethnic groups and proposed forms of self-governance to be attempts by indigenous leaders to create new positions for themselves. On the subject of indigenous self-determination, Rudolph thus quoted one person describing such proposals for autonomous zones as, quote, only a means to get Aborigines locked up in a cage so that people could look at them like monkeys in a zoo, unquote. But basically these new identities seem very remote from the livelihood issues of rural workers and farmers. The social division, which is at the forefront in political representation of difference, and those who remain apolitical, is characteristic of collective movements everywhere. In fact, in all of the villages where I stayed, and I've spent nearly 3 years now in Aboriginal villages, most people are more interested in things like the price of their crops, or on the contracts that labor contractors break with them and so forth, than they are about whether they're called Atayal or Sejek or Dorogu. But once the institutional framework for indigenous rights is there, then, and especially if they have the names of tribes and so forth, then the movement can more effectively organize around livelihood issues such as control of forests and shores, the danger posed by nuclear waste, and the right to hunt. The list of livelihood issues that has been raised during the Ma Ying-jeou administration is quite long. Non-livelihood issues such as creating new tribes or converting mountain townships into city districts, which they opposed, and then they got their mountain townships back, seem rather remote to most people. The sunflower movement also seemed quite remote. In fact, people in the village often thought these students were doing illegal things by taking control of the legislative yuan. So I'll show a few slides here about livelihood issues. So, for example, slash and burn agriculture is a part of life of some people living in mountain areas. And the forestry division has a habit of flying helicopters over and making them know that they are being watched. On the right-hand side here, we see a Tongban in Hualien, where they don't want all of these tourists coming in from China and polluting their village with their garbage and so forth. And so they have made a requirement here. They closed off the road and required the buses to stop outside of the village rather than coming in where it's dangerous, because in these villages there are dogs and children and so forth walking around. But then the tourists have to walk through the village rather than drive through. And so they had that conflict there. There was also in Tongban, there was a road blockade in December of 2013 about the question of people from the forestry division cutting down trees, which the local people see as their property because it's on their traditional territory. Another example, and this is down in the south, is opposition to a plan by the Taipower Corporation to store nuclear waste on traditional territory belonging to the Paiwan people. They've gotten the support of the Nantian Bulo, which is one village, and the government says that that's sufficient free, prior, informed consent, but they plan to put the nuclear storage on a site by a stream, and they have not consulted the people on the other side of the stream that also use that water for fishing and so forth. So this is another livelihood issue.